3 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mother sent me a text that read, "Sweetheart, we think it might be best if you sit this one out this year. The Ashfords are very traditional, and we just don't want anything to make things awkward for Derek. I run a tattoo studio. I've built it into one of the most respected fine art tattoo practices on the East Coast, featured twice in national magazines, booked 8 months out, employing 4 other artists whose careers I take genuine pride in helping build." To my parents, I was still just the tattoo thing they'd rather not explain to my brother's new fiancé's family. 4 days before the holiday, my brother called me, his voice tight, with something between desperation and shame, needing my signature on a document that could sink his entire engagement if I refused to give it. If this story is already hitting you somewhere personal, hit subscribe and drop where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment. My name is Wren Castellano. I'm 31 years old. This is what happened when my family decided I was too embarrassing to bring to Thanksgiving, and what happened 4 days later when they realized exactly how much they actually needed me. Let me take you back to how we got to that text message, because my parents' decision to uninvite me didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of quietly deciding my work was something to manage rather than something to be proud of. I opened Ironwood Tattoo 8 years ago, a small studio in a converted mill building outside Providence, starting with a single rented chair and a growing client list I'd built over 4 years of apprenticeship before that learning, under a demanding mentor named Sal Petrocelli, who ran one of the most respected shops in the state and rarely took on apprentices at all. My parents, Vincent and Diane Castellano, had never fully made peace with my career choice. My father, a retired civil engineer, measured legitimacy in terms of degrees and titles, the kind of career path you could explain in one clean sentence at a cocktail party. And my mother, a longtime elementary school administrator, worried openly and often about what our extended family and their social circle might think whenever the subject of my work came up at gatherings, particularly among her own colleagues at the school district's annual functions. My brother Derek, 3 years younger, followed a more conventional path, an MBA from a respected program, a steady position at a regional investment firm, and over the past 2 years, a relationship with Ashley Rain, whose family owned a controlling stake in a well-established textile manufacturing company, and moved in social circles our own modest middle-class family had never quite belonged to. My parents adored Ashley from the moment they met her, and adored even more the possibility of Derek marrying into a family with that kind of visible generational wealth, a possibility that seemed to occupy an increasing amount of my mother's attention over those 2 years' careful comments about making a good impression surfacing at nearly every family gathering. Over the 2 years Derek and Ashley dated, I watched my parents grow increasingly careful about how they presented our family to the Rains. Carefully curated stories at dinners, subjects steered away from anything that might complicate the polished version of the Castellanos they wanted Ashley's parents to see my father, even rehearsing once a version of his own career history that made his 30 years at a mid-sized engineering firm sound closer to a partnership than it had ever actually been. My tattoos, both the ones covering my own arms and the studio I'd built my entire adult life around, became a recurring source of quiet anxiety for my mother. Specifically, who mentioned more than once over those 2 years that I might consider wearing long sleeves just to keep things simple whenever the Rains were present. I wore long sleeves exactly twice at Derek and Ashley's engagement dinner, and again at a smaller family gathering that spring, mostly to keep the peace, though each time left me feeling smaller than I wanted to admit out loud, sitting through both dinners with a strange low-grade shame I hadn't felt about my own work in years, not since my earliest days building the studio, when I still second-guessed every choice I made. By the third request at a summer barbecue where the Rains were expected, I finally told my mother I wasn't willing to keep hiding a career. I'd spent a decade building successfully one that paid my mortgage, employed 4 other artists, and had that same year been featured in a national art and design magazine's profile on rising fine art tattooists, a profile I'd been genuinely proud of, and had shown my parents excitedly only to watch my mother's reaction land somewhere closer to polite tolerance than pride. My mother's response was gentle but firm, the tone she always used when she'd already decided something was final. I just think it's easier for everyone if we keep things simple around the rain, sweetheart. You understand? I didn't wear long sleeves to that barbecue. I also noticed for the rest of the summer a subtle shift in how my mother introduced me to new people in Ashley's orbit. My career mentioned vaguely, if at all, Wren does something creative standing in for an actual explanation. The text arrived on a Tuesday evening in early November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I read it twice before the full weight of it landed standing in my studio's back room between clients, my phone screen bright in the dim light. Sweetheart, we think it might be best if you sit this one out this year. The Ashford's my mother's autocorrect, apparently confusing the Wrens with some imagined more prestigious version of themselves a slip. I noticed even through the sting of the message itself, almost darkly funny in how precisely it captured her own anxious aspirations are very traditional, and we just don't want anything to make things awkward for Derek. There's a lot riding on this holiday for him. I hope you understand. We love you. I sat with that message for a long time before responding my studio's evening client already seated in my chair, waiting patiently while I collected myself enough to finish her session, without my hands shaking too visibly a fine-line piece on her collarbone that required a steadiness I had to consciously will myself back into. I texted back a single line, calm on the surface. I understand. Have a good Thanksgiving. I didn't understand. Not the specific casual cruelty of being asked to simply disappear from a family holiday, because my presence was considered a liability to my brother's engagement filed away like an inconvenient detail rather than a person. I found out the fuller context 2 days later from my cousin Bethany, who'd overheard my mother on the phone with an aunt, explaining the arrangement in more detail than she'd offered me directly. The Wrens' Thanksgiving that year wasn't just a family gathering. It was effectively an engagement showcase, a carefully orchestrated event at the Wrens' Newport estate, where Derek would formally be introduced to the extended Wren family and several of their business associates, an event my parents had apparently spent months anxious about, terrified of anything disrupting the impression they wanted to leave my mother reportedly rehearsing potential conversation topics with my father, the way some people rehearse a job interview. Your mom told Aunt Carol that having a tattoo artist at the table might raise questions they didn't want to field. Bethany told me, her voice careful, clearly uncomfortable relaying it, the kind of discomfort you can hear even over the phone. I'm sorry, Wren. I don't think it's fair for what it's worth. I told her I thought it was a pretty rotten way to treat your own daughter for what that's worth, too. I thanked her for telling me, hung up, and sat in my studio's back office for a long time afterward, staring at a stack of consultation sketches for an upcoming memorial piece. A client's late father's handwriting recreated in careful linework work. I was deeply proud of work that had nothing whatsoever to do with the version of me my parents were apparently ashamed to seat at a dinner table. Have you ever been asked to make yourself smaller specifically, so someone else could look bigger in front of people whose opinion mattered more to your family than your own feelings did? Sit with that for a second, because I sat with it for days, going back and forth between anger and a strange, exhausted resignation, unsure which one was actually going to win out by the time Thanksgiving arrived, replaying the wording of my mother's text over and over until the sentence stopped, meaning anything at all the way words do when you've looked at them too long. 4 days before the holiday, my phone rang. Derek, not my parents. I almost let it go to voicemail, still raw from the text, but something made me answer, some mixture of curiosity and old habit neither of us had quite outgrown. Wren, he said, his voice tight in a way I rarely heard from him. I need to talk to you about something important. It's about Grandma Rosa's trust. Our grandmother, Rosa Castellano, had passed away 4 years earlier, leaving a modest trust split evenly between Derek and me. Structured with an unusual provision, our grandmother had insisted on any withdrawal above $15,000 required both siblings' signatures, a decision she'd made specifically. Our mother once told me, because she wanted to make sure neither of us could be pressured into large financial decisions alone, without the other's knowledge and agreement, a small, deliberate protection built into the paperwork, by a woman who'd apparently understood even then how easily one sibling's needs could quietly overshadow the other's. What about it? I asked, already suspecting where this was heading, my stomach tightening with a familiar, uncomfortable premonition. I need to withdraw $42,000. Derek said the words coming out fast like he'd been rehearsing them and wanted to get through the hardest part quickly. For the engagement event. The venue deposit catering everything. Mom and Dad don't have that kind of money to contribute, and I can't cover it alone right now without dipping into savings, Ashley. And I need for the actual wedding. I need your signature by Friday, or we lose the venue deposit entirely, and the whole Thanksgiving event falls apart. I let the silence sit for a moment longer than was comfortable processing the strange, sharp irony of the situation. The same family gathering I'd been quietly erased from now depended financially on my direct cooperation to happen at all. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, keeping my voice level even as my pulse picked up. You need my signature to release money from Grandma's trust to fund an event I was specifically told not to attend because my presence might embarrass you in front of Ashley's family. Derek was quiet for a moment. I know how that sounds. It sounds exactly like what it is I said. You need something from me. Mom and Dad decided I was disposable right up until the moment my signature became financially necessary. Wren, please, he said, and I could hear underneath the tension something that sounded almost like genuine panic. I know this isn't fair to you. I fought Mom on the invitation thing, I really did, but she was worried about how the Rains would react, and I didn't push back as hard as I should have. I'm sorry. But I need this signature or I lose the venue, and honestly, I think Ashley's family might start questioning the whole relationship if this event falls apart at the last minute. I thought about it for 2 days before responding, sitting with the decision the way I'd sit with a difficult design before committing ink to skin, wanting to be certain, before I moved, running the whole situation over in my head during quiet moments between clients, turning it from every angle I could think of. I called Derek back on Thursday one day before his deadline, my decision finally settled. I'll sign, I said, but I have conditions. I want to be invited to Thanksgiving properly as myself, tattoos visible, no long sleeves, no hiding what I do for a living. If the Rains can't handle that, that's information you and Ashley deserve to have before you marry into that family, not after. Derek was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Let me talk to Mom and Dad. You don't need to talk to them, I said, my voice steady, despite the way my chest had tightened. You need to talk to yourself about whether you're willing to actually stand up for your sister or whether you're going to keep letting other people's comfort decide who gets a seat at your own family's table. I've watched you go along with this dynamic for years, Derek. This is the moment where that either changes or it doesn't. He called back 2 hours later. You're invited, he said. I told Mom this wasn't negotiable. I told her if she didn't want you there exactly as you are, then I wasn't sure I wanted the venue deposit released either trust or no trust. I signed the withdrawal form that evening and drove to Newport for Thanksgiving 3 days later, wearing a simple black dress that left both of my sleeve tattoos fully visible, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been 3 weeks earlier when I first read my mother's text. The Rains estate was exactly as imposing as I'd expected, though the dinner itself unfolded with less drama than I'd braced for. Ashley's father, a quiet, observant man named Charles Wren, noticed my tattoos within the first few minutes, and rather than the awkward disapproval my parents had apparently feared, asked genuine curious questions about the artistry behind a particular piece on my forearm, a detailed botanical design I'd designed myself years earlier, leaning in slightly to examine the fine line work with what looked like real appreciation rather than polite tolerance. That's remarkable work, he said, setting down his wine glass. Who did it? I did, I said, meeting his eyes steadily. I own a tattoo studio outside Providence. Fine artwork, mostly botanical pieces, memorial work, some restoration tattooing for scar coverage. Charles's eyebrows rose with genuine interest rather than judgment, and he glanced briefly toward his wife, who'd also leaned in to listen. My niece has been looking for someone to do a memorial piece for her mother for over a year now. Every artist she's found feels wrong for it, too generic, she says. Would you be willing to talk with her? I'd be happy to make the introduction. I told him I would genuinely pleased by the request, and we spent the next several minutes discussing memorial work, specifically the particular sensitivity it required, a conversation that drew the attention of two other guests seated nearby, who began asking their own questions about the process. My mother, sitting 2 seats down, went visibly pale at this exchange, watching the exact scenario she'd spent months anxious about unfold in the opposite direction from what she'd feared. Instead of embarrassment, Charles Wren's genuine curiosity had turned my career into the most interesting conversation at the table, several other guests leaning in to ask their own questions once the ice had visibly broken. Ashley, watching this unfold, reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, a small private gesture of solidarity that told me she'd understood all along more than my parents had given her credit for. My mother found me alone near the dessert table later that evening, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, her hands twisting together the way they did when she was genuinely uncomfortable, rather than simply performing discomfort. "I was wrong," she said, "about all of it. I spent so long worried about what the Wrens would think that I never once considered what it actually cost you to be treated like something to manage, instead of someone to be proud of. I watched you tonight talking with Charles about your work, and I realized I'd never once asked you those same questions myself. Not with any genuine curiosity behind them. You didn't just worry, Mom," I said. "You uninvited me. You decided my presence was a liability before anyone had even given me the chance to be anything else. You didn't even give the Wrens the opportunity to react badly. You made that decision for them based entirely on your own fear." She nodded slowly, absorbing that without argument, her eyes glistening slightly under the dining room's soft lighting. "I know. I'm genuinely sorry, Wren. I don't have a good excuse, just an honest one. I let my own anxiety about how we'd be perceived matter more than how you'd actually feel being erased like that. I think some part of me has been embarrassed by things about myself for so long that it became easier to project that onto you instead of examining it directly. I didn't fully forgive her in that moment, standing near a dessert table at a stranger's estate, but I appreciated the honesty more than I expected, to the specific admission that her fear had been about herself all along. Not really about me or my work at all. Derek approached me before I left that night, quieter than usual, waiting until most of the other guests had drifted toward the living room for coffee before he found me alone by the coat closet. "Thank you for signing," he said, "and for pushing back the way you did. I should have done that myself without needing you to force the issue. I've been thinking about it all night, honestly, how easily I let Mom's anxiety become the deciding factor in something that should have been mine to decide." "You should have," I agreed. "But you did eventually. That matters more than getting it right immediately." I meant it, even though some part of me still ached from the 3 weeks of being quietly erased before he'd finally found the nerve to correct it. He hugged me then longer than our usual brief brotherly embraces and said quietly, "I'm going to do better. I mean that." I believed him mostly the way you believe someone who's just watched in real time exactly what the alternative costs. 6 months later, I completed the memorial piece for Charles Wren's niece, a delicate portrait design incorporating her late mother's handwriting work that led through word of mouth within their social circle to 3 additional commissions from people I never would have met if I'd stayed quietly uninvited that Thanksgiving, each new client arriving with a level of genuine respect for the craft that felt like a small, ongoing correction to years of quiet family embarrassment. My parents attend my studio's annual client showcase, now genuinely my mother occasionally bringing friends from her own circle to see the work firsthand. Standing near my pieces at the showcase with something that looks more often than not now like actual pride instead of careful tolerance, a small steady correction to years of quiet embarrassment I've chosen to accept without needing it to be perfect. Derek and Ashley married the following spring, a smaller, warmer ceremony than the engagement showcase had suggested might be coming, held at a vineyard an hour outside Newport that Ashley had apparently chosen specifically because it felt less performative than her family's usual venues. I did the floral design on Ashley's veil myself, a small private commission neither of us ever mentioned to the wedding planner, delicate botanical linework, echoing the same style I'd used in the piece Charles had first noticed at that Thanksgiving dinner, my own quiet way of being part of something I'd once been told I might ruin simply by showing up as myself. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever been asked to make yourself smaller so someone else could feel more comfortable, tell me what it took for you to finally say no. I want to know we're not alone in this. My family spent years deciding my work was something to explain away rather than celebrate, and it took one signature, one dinner table, and one stranger's genuine curiosity to finally show them exactly how wrong they'd been about what actually deserved a seat at their table. I don't tell this story looking for anyone to feel sorry for the version of me who wore long sleeves twice just to keep the peace, or who read that text message and quietly typed back, "I understand," when I genuinely didn't. I tell it because I think a lot of people know exactly what it feels like to be treated as a liability to manage, instead of a person to be proud of, right up until the moment their cooperation becomes necessary for something else entirely. I'm glad I finally said no to being erased quietly. I wish it hadn't taken a trust fund and a deadline to get there, but I'll take the lesson either way.